Last time we showed that neither Jesus nor his earliest followers were Christians. We saw why we really shouldn't use the word Christian for anyone or anything earlier than about 300 Common Era. As far as what Christianity is today, we owe it all to Constantine. Our churches, our liturgies, the stuff we wear at liturgy, the stuff we do. All the familiar stuff. It all comes from the time of Constantine. So then what should we call earlier believers? You know, people from the First and New Testaments. Okay, so let's go back in time to around 1800 BCE. This is the time period of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What do we call these people? At this time, we find the mysterious Apiru. Sounds a lot like Hebrew. Apiru meant outsiders. They were a wide configuration of nomadic peoples. Sumerians tell of a group of Aramean nomads living in southern Mesopotamia as Apiru. These motley, non-related tribes settled wherever they wanted, and many of them were considered robbers and murderous raiders. So what was Abraham? He was likely Apiru. The Hapiru continue through 1400 BCE and the time of Moses. You know, there are so many layers to the history by later peoples, so many recontextualizations. Unified initially under the short-lived Davidic and Solomonic kingdoms, between 950 and 587 BCE, we encounter Israelites. But the history of ancient Israel is marked throughout with several significant and irreversible changes stemming out from major social alterations. At the end of this time, radical geographical change and displacement occurred, and Israelites were expelled or forced into one-way emigration. Others were forcibly brought into the land via one-way immigration. All of these peoples had little hope of returning to their place of origin. This is the formation of the so-called diaspora. From 520 BCE all the way until 70 Common Era, we have the period of the Judeans. Judeans is the right translation of Yehudim in Hebrew and Judaioi in Greek. Judeans are all those people who lived or originated in what became the Persian colony of Yehud, under Persian cultural influence and rule around 500 BCE. During the Persian period, with the formation of the Persian colony of Yahud, south of Samaria, and the adoption of Persian customs by the various peoples who worshiped the god Yah, third-generation Yahud people, with their temple in Jerusalem, were proud of their Persian origins, as indicated by the adoption of many Persian customs. For instance, their use of esoteric language in their sacred writings, or the idea of the eternal flame in the temple, or belief in angels, and devils. The special role of the Satan. The idea of a garden called paradise. Resurrection belief, where the righteous dead are transformed into stars. As well as by the formation of a Parsi political religious group called Pharisees in the New Testament. And all those old stories about Moses, or even earlier ones about Abraham and his family before, were composed by Persian-authorized scribes. For example, Solomon's Temple. Did it ever exist? Folks, it is probably entirely mythical, created by Persian scribes. By the way, this stuff never gets covered by popular speakers and authors like Scott Hahn or Robert Barron. These people present the Bible like it's one big linear timeline of events, like from an epic novel or movie. So what do we call Israelites living in New Testament times? Well, you can never go wrong by calling them Israelites. In fact, the best thing to call them is Israelites. Outsiders to the Roman province of Syro-Palestine living at the same time might have collectively labeled any native from the land of Israel as Judeans, or barbarian Israelites. That is, Israelites who live in the land of Judea, speak the barbarian language Aramaic, and adhere to barbarian customs, like the dietary codes and genital mutilation practices. But what if you were an Israelite living in the land of Israel? Well, then you would distinguish your fellow Israelites regionally or geographically. And in that case, you would consider somebody to be a Judean if he or she lived in the vicinity of Jerusalem. But if they lived around the Sea of Tiberias, you would call them Galileans. And if they lived in the eastern Transjordan, you would call them Pereans. But you know what nobody would call them back then? No one would call them Christians or Jews. None of these people are Christians or Jews. You see, at this time, Pharisees, Sadducees, Jesus group people we could call Messianists, Essenes, and other political religious sects, but there were no Christians or Jews yet. Contrary to widespread spurious belief, Christians and Jews come centuries later on. How did that come about? Well, in order to understand that, we have to see what took place in the year 70 Common Era and what happens after 70 Common Era. Try to imagine what a cataclysm the destruction of the temple at the hands of the Romans was for the Judeans. Can you appreciate how earth-shattering that must have been? Israelite faith was all about this temple. It was where you, as an Israelite, went on pilgrimage 3 times a year. The sole place you worshipped, meaning offered sacrifice. This temple is what your faith was all about. This temple was how you did your practice. Now, temple was gone. So what were Israelites going to do? During the Roman destruction of henotheistic Israel's central temple, the center of their life, the center of political religion, new social structures or new social situations emerged. 2 prevailing Israelite groups learned how to breathe underwater. They evolved away from prevailing political religion to newly exclusive fictive kinship religion. Everything got redefined and reshaped. And all those other Judean groups that could not adapt, they went extinct. After 70 Common Era, legendary Pharisee Yochanan ben Zakkai founded the academy at Yabna. Eventually, Rabbinic Judaism sprang from this. And eventually, out of this and further developments, the Talmuds were produced, the Babylonian and the Palestinian. And the Judaism we know today, practiced by Jews, is rooted in Talmudic practices. But the Talmuds come around 500 Common Era, and therefore there are no Jews before at least 500 Common Era. In fact, Jew is a medieval English word inappropriate to describe anything prior to 500 Common Era. Christian, as we saw in a previous video, is inappropriate to apply to anything prior to 325 Common Era. The analogy for the relationship between Jews and Christians, then, is like that between sisters in the womb, not between parent and child. Therefore, at the end of the 1st century, Jesus groups may be thought of as Israel awaiting the theocracy proclaimed by Jesus, and Ben Zakkai's groups may be thought of as Israel awaiting the restoration of the temple. Consider this. Back in 1000 BCE, David's court storyteller, someone called by scripture scholars the Yahwist, combined older Semitic myths and legends, some going way back deep into Apiru times, and made a new story. This new story recontextualized the older myths and legends about the patriarchs, all giving justification for the Davidic kingdom's existence. Folks, please, when you're reading the Bible, don't look for Ancestry.com DNA-accurate bridges between heroes and events, okay? Memories get updated, reshaped, retold. Historically speaking, the Exodus story was invented by Judean scribes 1,000 years later during the Persian period, modeled after their own immigration from Persia. In other words, the relationship between Judeans in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah and legendary Abraham the Apiru is mythic. Understanding that helps us a great deal in recognizing the same about how Jews and Christians today relate to New Testament times and groups. Please don't look for Ancestry.com DNA-accurate apostolic succession links when you're reading Matthew chapter 16 or John chapter 21. And in the same way, don't look for that between Jews and ancient biblical peoples either. The genocidal hatred Christians have perennially unleashed against Jews is not only horrendously evil. The theological justifications used repeatedly to excuse pogroms, expulsions, and even worse atrocities committed against Jewish people are also absurd. There were no Jews existing in Jesus' day and for centuries afterward. How can we then blame Jews for rejecting him or crucifying him? Not only would doing that be evil, it would be ridiculous. The same thing goes for theological justifications fundamentalist Christians use for racist Zionism and its genocidal actions against Palestinians.